Hello adventurers! If you are new to the Red Quills, then welcome. If you are not new to the Red Quills, then welcome back. Today we are going to be having a great time being a part of Madeline James's Worldbuilding Festival. I am so pleased to be here. And what we're going to do today is we're going to, in two parts, create a map and discuss the making of that map with a particular focus, firstly, on how to name the points that you have on your maps, and secondly, on how to illustrate your map. So what I've got here, you can see, I'm going to switch to my camera for drawing. You can see that I have already started with a grid layout that you can use to create your map. What I've done is I've just got a 5 centimeter by 5 centimeter grid, and the idea is it's not there to help me illustrate anything. It's there for later so that I can measure the distances between everything on the coast and the sea tiles. So I hope everyone's been enjoying the festival so far. I personally haven't been able to see a few of them live because, alas, I'm in Australia. So to all of my viewers in America, it's absolutely lovely to join you in the dead of night, and to all of those who are in Australia, good morning. The weather's lovely today, isn't it? Hello everyone, it's great to see you. I've got my stream over there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to divide my attention between the drawing of the map and chatting with everyone and saying hello. It's great to see you all. So what I'm going to start with, without further ado, is I'm going to start by creating the coastlines first, because I'm going to focus on creating this map for the benefit of the players. Now, if you've seen my other videos, then you know that what I tend to do is start with what we call the immovable parts of the map first, so that they aren't broken up by anything else. If you've got a coastline or a mountain range, you're not going to divide them with labels or with any other symbols or iconography, because they are the most permanent parts of your map. So that's what we're going to start with. Got a UniPin pen here, it's quite thick, and I'm going to start by drawing an island archipelago. While I'm doing this, how has everyone been enjoying the festival so far? Have you been seeing some great new ideas, getting some concepts ready for your own worlds? Hello, Madeline. Welcome. For everyone who's watching, you're probably aware, but of course, Madeline is the organizer of this event, and absolute props to her for organizing this. I'm so impressed by the amount of dedication that it has taken to wrangle such a herd of cats as these YouTubers. It is wonderful to be a part of it. Great community, and I will absolutely be checking out several of the videos that have an expertise in things that I am not particularly good at. Maps I know and love, but creating music, deciphering conlang, creating fantasy outfits, I'm so excited for it. It's going to be fantastic. What I'm going to go for here, I reckon, is I think an island chain. I'm thinking New Zealand or Japan even. Something that we can really sink our teeth into when we get to the naming part of it. Because if we use an island chain with a mountain range down the middle, we're going to get quite a variety of different terrains, different biomes, different habitats, and of course a very impassable stretch of land will mean that we can have a lot of different dialects within quite a small area. So I'm thinking each of these squares can be about 50 miles. It's not an enormous map. What we're looking at here, it's about 450 miles to the side, but it does give us a fair amount of space to work with, whilst not being so far out that we can't label, local areas. All right, how are we going, everyone? Good to see you all. I'm going to do my best to read and draw at the same time, although be warned, I am talking, drawing, and reading at the same time does even begin to break my ability to multitask, which I apologize for. All right, so whilst I'm doing this, and I'm going to finish off by adding a few more islands, and then we're going to actually start getting into the naming of it. If you want to stick into the chat any requests that you want to see for the landscape of this, I will, of course, I've got my main topics, but if anyone says, oh, I'd really love to see a redwood forest, I would love to see a volcano, then now is the time to put it in while I am creating this outline. You can notice I am sketching the sketch phase of this. I always do recommend you sketch first so that you know what the balance is going to look like, particularly when you're trying to draw names and that, so that you don't slip your letters in and out of other areas. But in this particular case, I wanted to get right down to it. I did do a live stream not long ago in which I created a whole map from scratch, and that took about 7.5 hours. And that was a lot of fun. But I've only got two 2-hour sort of slots for this particular map. So I'm aware that we really need to kind of cut out as much time as possible when creating this map. All right, what do we reckon? Do we want to add anything else? What do we love? Lakes, barrier islands. Oh, I love that. Glacial lakes. Okay, we can do that. Okay, first of all, let's start with some barrier islands. What I'm thinking here is you can see that we've got like a strait here. If I create a large sort of bowl-like ancient atoll, we can imply the existence of a mega volcano long in the distant past that exploded. The caldera is still left, and it creates this sort of inland sea with some islands that we can put some very interesting naming conventions on. Because of course this is a fantasy world. Everyone knows that there be monsters in the places that humans don't want to live. What do I reckon? I think I'll stick a little... I'm going to actually imply that it's a meteor caldera. Caldera? Crater. Thank you. There we go. And we'll do some lakes. What I'm thinking is I'm going to put a mountain range right through the center. I'm fairly familiar with New Zealand geography, having gotten lost there myself. But that just means that I'm going to have a fairly long mountain range on this one, and we're going to branch off in several directions from a central peak here. What do we reckon? There we go. If we put some near the sea, then those can be brine lakes, even marshlands or fens. I've lost my cap, excuse me. All right, there we go. Now, I have discussed making mountain ranges before. I'm going to zoom right in here. And I know I said I'd skip the sketch part, but I will show you very briefly how I tend to do it. We use long sweeping lines with a pencil like this to show us the direction, and single lines show us branches and ridges, and the two solid lines there show us the main parts of it here. And then if we can we can show if the land has been broken up, if it's not a continuous ridge line. That's how we can do that. All right, there we go. And I think that gives us a fair few places there. All right, cool. Nice and easy. Old and eroded cliffs, we can definitely do hedge 610. Oh, Dylan, absolutely, I can tell you what paper I'm using. This is a Montmartre 180 GSM A3 spiral book. It is available quite easily down here in Australia. I'm not sure about its availability up in the United States, but for those who are wondering, my list of materials is in the description below. If you do have any specific questions, I'm very happy to answer them, but I've tried to kind of stick any links in down there before we start. I will note, however, that the pen that I intended to use for my Coastlines, which is an Artliner 0.6mm black Fineliner, actually ran out of ink this morning. So I have switched to this UniPin black noir PC 1M, which is 0.7, so it still should be fine. But what I quite like about the bullet shape here is if you do this sort of main spine here, it has a really good flick to it. So you can see how it kind of really tapers off there. It makes a nice looking shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down, do one side first, varying the length of those shapes, and that gives it a consistent sort of height. It allows the eye to determine that it's like one long continuous ridge line. And I'll do those ones as well. And then we come on the other side, do the exact opposite. And this is a really simple way of doing it. There are ways in which you can do individual peaks, of course, but I quite like this because it is simple, It's quick. We can add some shading in a bit that makes it pop out even more, but it means that we're going to have more time to talk about the labels, which I will do after we've done the mountains. All right, we just got to set this down first, right? So we do that jiggling line there, always bringing it up to some peaks. You can see if we pull it suddenly up like a piece of string that's being brought skyward, you can see where the peaks are going to be in the end. But making it as zigzagging, as chaotic looking as possible gives us much more sort of a natural feel to work with. And then we can kind of bring that feeling of chaos and, there we go, naturalism to the map. And we do that with all of them, and then I will do these downstrokes whilst I try to read comments. All right. Boop-a-doop-boo. Thank you for the compliment, Mind the Wizard. It is a great deal of practice at this point. You know, I got a comment on one of my videos not long ago, because I always say in my videos that a great deal of the skill in map making is just practice. And someone was like, oh, you know, that really reduces it. Some of us, you know, just don't have any artistic talent. And I just wanted to take this live opportunity to say that, be that as it may, I have spent over the last 2 years probably in excess of 1,600 hours making maps for videos, for commissions, for personal projects. And my level of talent at the beginning notwithstanding, no matter how bad I was at the beginning, that amount of practice has taught my hand to do what my eye wants it to do. That level of hand-eye coordination, that muscular development, that learning to control the pen, the materials, does come from just exposure over time. And so I would say, if you are feeling that you don't have the prerequisite level of talent to do this kind of thing, then it is just a matter of sitting down and practicing and practicing and practicing, which does sound like a bit exhausting. But I will say, if you enjoy the process more than the end result, then you're in good stead for later on. All right, you can see I'm getting closer to the end of this mountain range, and I do want to note, you can see that towards the southeast down here, I've extended these lines that come out from the mountain range and made them a bit steeper, and as we go up, they're getting shallower and shorter, so that you can see that the mountain range, even to the eye, looking at the map, gets less and less of a barrier. Gets flatter and flatter as we go out to sea. All right, we got to finish this one off, and then we will get started with the labeling. All right, beautiful, beautiful. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to one of my smaller pens. This is my Artliner. You can't read it anymore because I use it so much. This is my Artliner 200. It's a 0.4 millimeter fineliner pen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start labeling the regions first, and then I'm going to use a red pen to label the individual cities and villages, and then we'll go through and label the natural formats. Because the first question that I've got for this particular series is, which is of course naming points, I love that, is what are you naming, right? When you create a map, you want to be first of all aware that you are naming areas that are significant to the map itself. And when we do that, you can of course break it down into various categories. Grand land. Sorry, naming and talking, I found this out in previous live streams. Naming and talking at the same time is annoyingly difficult. Do stick your naming suggestions in the chat. That will help me to talk and name at the same time. But what we're going to do is, yes, I'll do the regions first. And the reason that I want to do the regions first is because if you do the settlements first, even though they're more important to navigating around the world, it will make the map more difficult to read. Whereas we can label settlements on the outside of the coastline, but we can't really name the regions over a different area because then it won't be as clear what we're referring to. Does that make sense? Oh, welcome to the channel, Sengam Baram. I'm sorry, I'm reading from a distance as well. So what I'm going to do, I've broken the topic of naming places. You can just see my hands. I've broken the topic of naming people down into naming places, down into 3 different questions. The first of them is what you're naming, which is to decide what kinds of labels you are putting on your map, right? So if we break it down, you're going to have, of course, settlements. You're going to have the regions and the realms. You're going to have landmarks. Then you're going to put geography. And then last of all, you're going to put routes and crossings. And the reason for that is very, very simple. If you start with settlements, and that's the places where all the plot is going to happen, if you've got a TTRPG or if you've got a novel. What am I going to call this? Myth Veil. Cool. The next important part is to understand the politics and the culture. So that's why you're going to put the regions and the realms next. After that, you're going to be looking at, once again, the plot, which is often going to happen in landmarks like ruins or castles or monuments or religious places. Then you're going to talk about the actual land. You're going to do more world building once you've got the plot out of the way, and you're going to label forests and coastlines and mountain peaks and whatnot. And then finally, after that, is the roads and the routes, like trading routes and rivers and things like that. And the reason that we're leaving those until last is because a lot of the time, those roads and routes and rivers are named after the things that they are nearby or the regions that they are within. Myth Veil. What are we going to look at? I need more. Myth Veil. I'm going to use an Anglo-Saxon naming structure here as well. I'm just going to point that out right now because it's something that I'm familiar with. I speak English, of course, and I know that there are other streams in this playlist that talk about, creating languages and talking about making syntax and things like that. And I don't want to tread on any toes, but the concepts that we're going to be dealing with here are actually separate to language. They're at the use of language rather than the creation of language. All right, what I'm going to call this Old Dunar. Dunar. As in sand dunes. And we'll go into, when I talk about it later, how we're naming places and why we're naming places once we've finished with this particular one. Casterly. You might recognize some names like Casterly from other books or novels or even from real life, because I am basing it, of course, on real words. Downshire. And there's, of course, going to be some crossover there as well. Tolling Vale. All right, so we're just taking some names at this point, just the area descriptor like realm or land or vale, and we're adding a precursor to it that describes it. Downshire is, of course, a hilly area. Casterly is a response to having castles in the area. Dunes, broken, green, tolling, and you can degenerate some of these names in order to make them feel more real. We'll talk about that later. But any suggestions that you have for actually naming things is helpful, because it is difficult to talk and do this. All right. Okay, what are we going to think? Forester. And if you have repetition of these names as well, it gives it a feeling of continuous discussion. So Downshire and Forester. I'm going to put one up here that is going to be Fernshire. There we go. Would you believe that I actually wrote up a list of suggested names to help me with this and then completely forgot to print it off because I had a technical issue? And what can you do after that? All right, and then once we've got the realms, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come through with a red pen. This is a Statler Fineliner, And we're going to do the towns, right? And while we do the towns, I'm going to talk about the next point, which is how are you naming things, right? So as before, I'm going to move this camera a little bit so you can see everything. As before, we have to go through and name everything in a way that feels believable, that uses the same language and has the same sort of concepts and repetition that makes it feel like a person who lives over here in Casterly, inhabits the same world and deals with the same problems and day-to-day living conditions that someone up in Fernshire does. And how we do that is by creating these sort of linguistic and theoretical strings, concepts that continue throughout. So the first one is descriptive naming, and we've already kind of broken ground on that already. So Broken Realm is a very descriptive realm. That's why I put it down first, so we can kind of talk about that. And we can do that with cities by naming something like Or's Rest. Right? Or's Rest. I actually forgot the S in there. Or Rest, sure. Or's Rest gives us a description of the function and the history and the culture of the town. It tells us exactly what happens there. It is, a sailing spot. We're expecting to see a lot of riverboats and things there, so there'll definitely be a river there later. You can be more and more descriptive. A lot of fancy names use this, like Silverton, named after the stone that they used to build the houses. Or we can have, going completely blank, a Slate Brook. These are descriptions of the places in which you find them. There's actually one down here in Victoria in Australia that I'm going to use here because it gets me every time. It's called Lakes Entrance. And isn't that a description of exactly what you'll find when you get there? Light Break. And you get it all the time in the real world. Back where I was growing up, there was a suburb nearby called Claremont, which is, French for light hill, or light mountain. And, that kind of thing works all the time. Midland is something that you come across all the time. I'm actually going to call this Middle Vale. And one last one before we move on is going to be descriptive. Oh, I know, Smokestack. Love it. Nice and easy, right? And then we move on to the second one, which is, of course, commemorative naming. When you've got commemorative naming, you're thinking about naming things after people, after concepts, after events that have happened in the past. So we'll talk, Baldur's Gate is a really famous D&D example of that, and we can certainly use that here. We'll put Augustine, named after Augustus, presumably. Alexandria is another great example of that, but we can call this Nivelar's Stop. Nivelar's Stop. Don't know where I got Nivelar from. We're going Anglo-Saxon here, Ryan, you dingus. All right, we're going to call Old Tom's Inn. It's a town now. It was once an inn, presumably. And then we'll call this just Dudars. Presumably a guy called Dudar lived there. All right, mythic naming is the next one. And this is not, so if we call the commemorative naming tied to history, the mythic naming is tied to the much broader mythology and the religion and the concepts. And the difference is that history tends not to change so much, as long as it is being recorded. That's kind of the point of history. Whereas mythology will change all the time, historically speaking. So we can change the concepts and what they mean over time. So if we say that this one over here is called God's Fall, right? That could mean any number of things. God's Fall could refer to the place where, a dead god fell from the sky, or it could refer to the fact that there's a waterfall there that looks really, really good. If we come over here and we name this place King's Bourne, Is it, you know, the king's castle? Is it where the king was born? What's the deal there? And we want to kind of name things in a mythic light that have these sorts of threads to them, because a map is just as much of a guide to the world building as the writing is. And in fact, a map can imply a great deal of world building without having to write it out into 1,000 words. Edmund's Cove, I love it, Hedge 610. And Morgensburg. Actually, Morgensburg is great. I'm going to put that in. It is more Germanic. Morgensburg, of course, Berg is a Germanic word, which means town or castle. And I will come to Edmund's Cove later. I'll do the nature ones later on, but I quite like, oh, I could make it. No, I'll make it a town. This cove here, Edmund's Cove. I'm actually going to make it one word because I'm running out of space. Oh, no. Hatchet's Respite, a place where woodsmen and axemen go to rest. I like that, Hatchet. I might change it to a name, though. Oh, no. No, I'm going to go with your suggestion. I quite like that. So we're getting the concept quite well. And of course, by necessity, those mythological places will be much less common than the historical, those commemorative places, because it's supposed to feel mythic. And if you've got a world that does feel real, then a lot of those places won't be really, really big. They won't be worth putting on a map because they're not going to be referred to daily. But the locals will have their own places on the small maps. They'll be able to refer to things that aren't on the maps because other people, 50 miles over don't believe in them, but they and their neighbors and their grandparents and their grandchildren all do. All right, which brings us to the last one, which is nicknaming. And this is the most fun to do in a map like this because it really grounds the world. It makes it feel real, right? Because a lot of the common names that you will get in England, in Scotland, in a lot of English-speaking countries now come from this concept of nicknaming, because you've taken the description or the commemorative name of a town and you've really just reduced it as much as possible to being, as easy to say as possible. All right, so if we take the town name Southend Town, easy to reduce that to Southerton. All right, this is what you're kind of going to be aiming for in order to make your world feel lived in. Blacksmith's Quarry. Oh, I don't like that actually. Smith's Quarry. Let's work with that. Smithwick. Smithic. Smithwick. How do I spell ek? Smithic? Oh, with a Y, obviously. Smithic. Smith's Quarry, Smithic. And we'll add in a few of those. And the point is they don't really need to make sense, because names that have been said daily for 1,000 years, they don't need to make sense anymore. I mean, if you sat down for half an hour at a time and repeated the same word over and over, by the end you will feel like it doesn't make sense. So that's kind of what we're going for here. Wind Watch. Windower. So that one's actually a good example. Oh. I'm just... Dang it, Ryan. This is why you don't talk and write. So I was going to say Wind Watch is a good name for a town, but you could reduce that to Windower, right? Which isn't shorter, but it is a little easy to say. It has that alliteration. It has a bit of rhyme to it as well, which I quite like to have. Okay. So now we've got a fair number of names in there. I'm just giving examples at this point, and then we can discuss in more depth as we go on through. I mean, we're only half an hour through at this point. We've still got the majority of the map making to go. All right, so that's actually most of the main islands. What I'm going to start doing is adding a few of the outer islands in habitations. I'm going to change this up again. There we go. What do we reckon? Which brings us to how we name. Okay, we kind of talked about that already when we're talking about, why we're naming, what we're naming, the particular patterns we're using. But now that we're talking about nicknames, let's break that down and how we can kind of talk about how people name, not because they want to describe the place, but because they want it to fit with the pattern that everything else has been named and degenerated into over a great deal of time. So, for instance, I think that Shire as a description is great to use for that, because Forestshire, Downshire, Fernshire all share that last syllable. But a shire being, you know, an area is a really interesting kind of thing to add onto the forest shire or a down shire. Like that's a hilly area, that's a forested area, that's a ferny area. But shire is supposed to be sort of a political breakdown. So why are they using shire to denote, you know, an area that isn't necessarily a politically defined one? So I think that's really interesting. Vale's a fun one as well, because Vale is, of course, like a valley. You know, it's a protected area between higher points. But this obviously, Tolling Vale down here, I'll move the camera, that's not a valley, that is an island. We want to take the naming patterns so that they don't really make a lot of sense descriptively, but they do match and repeat. They rhyme with the rest of the world. All right, here we go. So degenerative names, we kind of already talked about when we came to, you know, Windwatch and turning into Windower, but we can kind of move that on further. Like in real life, you have all sorts of names that are made much shorter or much more easy to say. Even in the modern day, Melbourne, for example, down here in Australia, is spelt Melbourne, but it is pronounced with as many as 6 letters at most, which is Melbourne. You know, take off as many letters as you possibly can to make it more easy to pronounce, and you're along the right track. So we're going to call this place, okay, what should we start with? It's up towards the north. We're going to say it is Ash and Grey Cliffs. I quite like that. It has a nice poetic movement to it. Ash and Grey Cliffs. Ashengra. Cool. Ashengra. Right? That's a way to reduce that from being something that's quite descriptive into something that's degenerated over time. All right? Which brings us then to translinear names. And what I mean by that is when you've got people, like in an area like this, like we're talking as in, for instance, England, again, we're going with that Anglo-Saxon linguistic route. You've got a small area that has been inhabited for thousands of years, and the people 50 miles from one another do share a language, but they have different dialects, different accents, different ways of enunciating and stressing the vowels that they're using. And so that means that they can call shared places different names, having different inflections and different meanings. And on a much grander scale, on a world scale, you've got that all the time. Take Japan, for instance, which is absolutely nothing like what the locals call it, which is Nihon. Nihon? Nippon? Nihon, yeah. Not super up with Japanese history. I probably should have chosen something I'm more familiar with. All right, but we're going to do that in a couple of ways. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out a thinner pen. This is my 0.1 millimeter fineliner pen. And we're going to do a couple of transliterations for these regions. So Broken Realm is quite a good option here because that's what everyone else will call it. But as someone who wants to live there, you probably won't call it the Broken Realm. You'll probably call it Goodenshire. Right? Completely different. If you are living somewhere that everyone else has labeled something negative, then it's very unlikely that you will refer to it as something that's negative. That's not something that locals tend to do. So the Broken Realm is a really good way of doing that. Goodenshire, again, you can take that to mean it's a good place, but I actually would suggest that that's named after someone, you know, Gooden or King Samuel the Good, something like that. Relating it back to Kingsbourne. And you can do that all over the place. Granland can be Grenover. Greenover. All right. And you don't need to do this all the time. Old Dunar. Old Dunar is an interesting one. Where's Dunar? I don't think I put one down. That's fine. We'll call that Visinga. All right. And again, we're going to try to put as many linguistic roots as possible throughout here. But if you do want to throw in gibberish and try to make it up later on, I encourage you to do that. All right, which brings us to euphony and rhythm. Euphony is things that sound the same, they rhyme. Rhythm has that sort of bump-ba-dum-ba-dum that we love to say over and over. So for instance, like the names in the Shire in Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit have that kind of feeling to them of being very storybook, being very sort of easy to say, easy to digest. So the water, the green dragon, there's all sorts of options in Oxfordshire in England. I did a map of there recently, like having inning upon height, right? Much, did I spell that wrong? Probably. Much longer name, but it has that sort of feeling of quaintness to it. They've got actual villages that are called things like Luxham upon Stoat or Billingsbrook. I actually like Billingsbrook. I'll put Billingsbrook in here. Billingsbrook. And that has that repetition to it, that alliteration, that makes it feel more comfortable, more childish. And we kind of want to bring that in. If you want your place to feel storybook, that's what you kind of want to go for. But you could also make it more grim dark. But if I call somewhere Delling Deep, you know, it feels a bit foreboding, but it does tell you that the setting is sort of this nice, quiet, quaint area. And that brings us to the last point in this, which is the borrowed patterns. The borrowed patterns, like we're talking about the shires, the vales, it really kind of brings to mind that these are words that have been used over and over and over until people have forgotten, or even if people have grown up and not been educated, never known the meaning of these particular words. Right, well, I'm seeing a couple of questions up there. I'm going to do one last name down here, which is Sea Under Sky. And I'm going to answer Sergei's question. Well, maps are fantastic. Thank you, Sergei. How do you, as a DM, get the maps to have a larger role in your game, almost like an NPC? Oh, that's a great question and has very little to do with naming places. But as I go through and I move on to the next area of what we're naming, which you might recall is our landmarks now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out a brown pen and I'm going to start naming the landmarks. I will talk about how I get these maps to play a larger role in the campaign. And this is actually a really good point to talk about on that, because I will, as I go through, highlight the landmarks that are going to be plot relevant. So the first things first is, generally speaking, when you give a map to your players, I've found that most DMs will, will give them a complete map, right? It has everything on it that they need in order to navigate or understand the world, and that's fine. And even if you do have two separate maps, one for you and one for them, then it means that they are only missing a couple of bits and pieces. So the first things that I did was, of course, I made the first map of my world and I gave it to them like a fool with all of the information on it that they would need in order to navigate the world, which is fine. But then what I started doing was I started adding in areas in which you would need to have a map in order to understand the world. So I made a second map that had a variety of landmarks like this on it that added to the plot but weren't on the map. So in order to move the plot forward, they had to find the information first. And it meant that they started to value the maps, not just as a means of navigation and understanding the world, but as a plot relevant prop piece. And then as I went through and I started making less sort of overview world descriptive maps and started making maps that you might have seen on the channel before. If you haven't already, then I would recommend checking them out if you want fresh ideas, like riddle maps, like treasure maps, like maps of, you know, magical artifacts, or I had a network of towers that you could use to teleport one from the other, but there was this sort of secret pattern of how to use it that they took a really long time to kind of figure out and get an understanding of. Once they did understand it, they needed to know which tower led to the other, and once they got that, then they could teleport near instantaneously from one point to another if they met certain conditions. And that meant that that was a hugely valuable and impressive tool for them to have for moving the plot forward and understanding the world. And it kind of gives, if you're thinking of your maps in and of themselves as being, you know, what you're trying to give to your players, I would suggest kind of altering your perspective to asking yourself, is the information you're giving to your players going to excite them? Because that's all this is. This is just a way of graphically representing the information of your world building. Good gracious. That was a fair discussion there. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these points on, and I will have some points that are only relevant to, let me zoom in, that are only relevant to, you know, navigating, like this lighthouse here. But I will put in points like up this one, which are going to be relevant to the world building, relevant to the plot. So I've got the Tower of Ice down there. I'm going to put the Tower of Fire up here. And I particularly like it, and I'm just going to point this out as an option for everyone. I love it when things are named because they only very vaguely actually look like the thing after which they are named. So if I put the Tower of Stone, but when you get to it, it does not look at all like a tower, and it looks instead like, you know, a vast pinnacle or an obelisk or even a huge cone of stone with a large bronze wedge on top. I think that's so evocative for building the world. I think it's fantastic. All right, we're going to call this one God's Wound. Nice and small. And that's what we're going to go through here. And remember what we were talking about. When you're naming places, I've gone for these are very descriptive names of what you can find, but you can also degenerate them as well. This one's a bit more dangerous if you forget what you're doing. So I would recommend finding some way of reminding yourself, if you degenerate a name of an icon or a landmark, of reminding yourself what that actually means. So if I call this place Queen's End, right? Then that could be interpreted a number of ways. I would write that as being, this is the location in which the king, who is the opposite to this particular queen, was rounding up an army to invade this island. He put together a massive fleet and was confronted by the queen, whom he then killed and sacrificed in order to, hashtag the Iliad, assure them safe passage from one island to another. And so it's named Queen's End after the fact that she was sacrificed there, but it has a greater historical significance as this sort of place of massive starting of the war. So it has that sort of traditional elongation of history and tradition there. All right, I'm going to name another one in that particular style. I will call this Solsholm. Right. I'm going to call this one Faintum. Right. And if you can, I'm not going to tell you the meanings of all of these. If you want to guess them in the comments, I think that's fun. But as we go through and I add in more and more names, I want to talk about how we're naming and not what I'm naming, because I think my maps names are less significant than the names that you want to be giving to your maps. Shades. Shadeshire. Cool, I love it. All right, so then we've gone through and we've named individual points. I'm actually going to put a couple more towers so that we can pull in the plot, Tower of Hills, and Tower of Storms. Actually, I'm going to put Tower of Clouds down here. Tower of Clouds. There we go. All right. And that's allowed us to kind of name the landmarks, which means that the next thing that we're going to be working on is naming the individual natural points. And I've used brown and red, and what we always want to do is make it easy to read. This is a player map that we're designing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out, once again, this 0.1 millimeter Fineliner pen. And I'm going to, in quite a small, tidy hand, come through and name individual points. Always label before you put icons on, before you put roads on, before you put rivers on, because the important thing that a map needs to be able to do is communicate the information on it as quickly and as accurately as possible. So you don't want to squish in names, you don't want things to overlap, you want it to be tidy and easy to read. So that's what we're kind of going to try to do here. Actually, I'm going to go even smaller. What's he talking about? I've got a point. Do I? Where's my 0.5 millimeter? No, all right, 0.1. Someone's taken my point. Oh, my points. I've got a number of very thin pens, but I did lend my pens the other day, and I don't think they put them back correctly. Nope, that's all right. 0.1 it is. Okay, so what I'm going to do, for instance, is come here and say God's child Glen, all right? And again, you've still got those delineations of names, whether they are, specifically descriptive, whether they are commemorative, whether they are mythic, what kind of mixture of those do you have? We'll call this the Oakwood. Can't get much more descriptive than that. That is fun if that is, a plain or a grassland was once a wood. And again, you can use that the opposite way around. That sort of descriptive labeling irony is very fun for world building, or names that have lasted longer than the thing that they were actually labeling. What should I call this? I'm going to call this Brothers End. And again, that is a description in a way. I think it's more of that commemorative thing, but it doesn't actually tell us what is being named. I'm thinking of it, it's a plain, it's a large, battle plain. I've got a lot of war on this particular map, but what can you do? We're going to call this one Point Salt Break. Sure. Again, descriptive, nice and easy. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not making up any names here. Here we go. Dylan, what do you say? The proto name I came up with is Rosinglen, which would later be dumbed down and shortened to Roseglen. Oh, I quite like that. I did do a map recently in a video. I talked about naming in that one as well, in which I made the map for a friend, and they asked that the humans speak English, the Elvish speak an Elvish, which is sort of Welsh, and they have like Mer people and Mero that speak a sort of Polish dialect. And what I did was similar to how Tolkien took, Baranduin, which is the Elvish name for the river that runs near the Shire, and the hobbits call it the Brandywine, because that's that sort of linguistic degeneration over time, but it retains that euphony and that rhythm that kind of brings it into the language with having an altogether different meaning to what it originally had, which I think is quite fun. That's a great option, Dylan. All right, I'm going to call this... okay, we're going to start labeling islands as well. But before we do that, I'm going to go through and I'm going to label this one Grey Comb. All right. Fear All right. So always think about, if you want to name things and make it interesting, if you can find synonyms that have the same kind of sort of sound or very similar sound, but an altogether different meaning and a different spelling, and you want to kind of put those together to have that feeling of dread, but without actually actively showing the dread. Like Fear March here is spelled differently. It looks on the map like it has nothing to do with the word fear. But if I were to say that out loud, it gives an altogether different meaning than if the players who are reading it, they probably won't actually in their heads pronounce that. They're just going to think, you know, march, person's place, which is, again, a very interesting story option for you to take. All right, we're going to come through, I'm going to label a couple of others, and then we're going to Night's March, and then we're going to come through and label the geography itself. And by geography, I mean, of course, the bays, the straits, the islands themselves. So good option, Noro Vale. Again, we're taking that suffix of Vale, which is quite common in this area. We're adding Noro to it. Noro sounds fairly like north. Again, it's degenerated over time, but it still uses that euphony, that rhythm. It has a meaning in the name. I'm going to do a sure as well. So if I say Sandishire, the Sandy Shire. We're going to take that degeneration of names over time, and we're going to just keep creating names like that. A good way is, if you do run out of sort of names, ideas that you can name things, if you want to keep it in English or whatever language you speak, just make a simple list of, you know, colors, of types of stone, of types of wood, and of common names. And by using those and adding them onto suffixes like vale or valley or march, or, you know, any of the kind of descriptive areas for towns, valleys, forests, and hills, then between those, and by degenerating them, you can make an infinite number of names. So I'd recommend that as an option. Last one is the point of no return. Because why not be a little bit ominous? Isn't that why we became DMs or GMs? All right, now we're on to the natural side, and normally this is where we start bringing the colors in, and I'm going to start bringing the colors in and naming the bays and the islands and whatnot. If you are naming natural things, I do recommend the black pen, because it will make it stand apart from the red of the cities and the brown of the landmarks. Always think about how to keep things on your maps within the same sort of color spectrum. So man-made or, you know, humanoid significant places are within the reds, natural places are within the natural places are within the greens and the blues, and then you've got other things, any other information can be in the purples, in the pinks, in, you know, that other side of the spectrum. But at this point, what are we going to put on? I had a Edmund's Cove. Thank you, Hedge. Where should I put Edmund's Cove? You know what? In here. Edmund's Cove. Now you'll notice that I haven't really delineated by, you know, what size the towns are, whether they're capitals, all that kind of stuff. We're just focusing on the names today. Long Hollow Cove. Again, very descriptive. Landsmeet. Just going to go through naming these. Landsmeet Mouth. Go through that. Hey Jess, welcome to the live stream. Love that you're loving it. I read Failmarsh. Fairmarsh. Oh, okay, cool. Sorry, that's Des Viper on Fearmarsh or Fairmarsh. Entirely up to you, honestly. But if you want to change it up, it could be F-E-E-R. However you want to do it to make sure that they're pronouncing it right. Because again, people will have different accents, different dialects. So I'm going to go through and name everything. And an easy way of doing the land labels is to ask yourself, if there's a settlement nearby or if there is an icon or a landmark nearby, can they be of a sort of similar vein, of a parallel meaning? So if I have the Tower of Fire here, and I can call this Flame Cove, that retains that sort of linear Flame Cove Bay, lol. Redundancies are also fun. That can retain that linear sort of meaning while still, you know, making it a different actual word. Speaking of Flame Cove Bay, redundancies are always fun. You know, Tutorberg City, Sahara Desert, Avon River. You can absolutely have redundancies of words that mean the same thing but have been added on if the word has fallen out of the common usage, if it is in a slightly different language, if the common folk, the people who are saying these things all the time, don't actually recognize what the word means. Those redundancies are really fun. They can add to the world building as well. Wishes Bay. And you can always, of course, just add in random words if you want to give yourself prompts for later. So I'm going to call this the Would-Be Cove. Possibly a reference to the king who wanted to conquer this other island over here. Again, talking about labels, very briefly, I'm going to use lowercase for less important areas like the bays and the coves and the straits, and I'm going to use uppercase for the islands. So if I call this Broken Helm Isle, that makes that label much more readable than the other, and it's going to draw the eye to what is going to be of more visual interest. You know what? I'm going to address up here. There we go. Des Viper's comment, and I'm going to spell it fear. Firma Isle. Any other questions? 41 watching, but only 20 thumbs up. It's fine. I know that the watching of videos on YouTube has been very commercialized. It's been very it's been given this sort of value that you need to like the things that you're watching, that you need to engage with the things that are watching. And I as a YouTuber, I understand that. I know how to that makes the channel more successful. But I also just want you guys to be able to enjoy yourselves. I'm going to call this Thunderbreak Isle because I like that. As I read some others. How does Shimmerstone Coast sound? Sounds great. Shimmerstone Coast. Shimmerstone Coast. Shimmerstone Coast. I'm going to put this up here. And again, we're going to go lowercase for that. Ask yourself if it's a complete object, like an island, like a pinnacle, you know, something that is separate from everything else, then it gets uppercase. If it is a part of something larger, then it gets the lowercase labels. Place upon holder. Place upon holder. I'm going to name this one Place upon holder. That's an excellent suggestion. Place upon holder. And we're kind of going through those three questions. What are you naming? What is important on the map? Why are you naming it? For the purposes of the plot, in order to flesh out the cultures, and how are you naming it? In order to kind of bring out, how are you naming it in terms of the structure of the name? Because we're always thinking about what information we are giving to the reader, to the audience members, so that it can flesh out the world. I'm going to call this Sunset's Grave. Again, sometimes just stringing together words that have no business being together is a great way to name things. Thrown dice and Viscount's glory is a great way to be like, oh, you know what? I can absolutely just ad-lib a story out of that. Hide Vale. You don't have to call everything names. You don't have to name things precisely what they're supposed to be. If you say, you know, Myth Vale or Grenlands, then that's fine. That is a description of the land. But if you're going through and you're naming an island, you don't have to attach isle or island to the end of every single one of them. If your name is significant and idiosyncratic enough, they'll just understand which one you're talking about, especially if there's only one of that thing. That's the sort of downside of having descriptive names, is that they can be easily repeated. So I'm just going to call this one over here, I realized I moved off the map. This one up here is just going to be called the hand, right? There's only one of it. Nothing else is called the hand. So I don't need to say the hand isle or the hand islands or the hand rocks. It's just the hand. And that's all we kind of really need. You know what? On that note, I'm going to call this the skull. Gives us a bit more world building there. And yes, I'm making up all of these words as we go along. If you have your own world and you've done a bit of world building and you know what kind of theme you're going for, and again, there's so much to say on that kind of topic, then you will be able to figure out, you know, what it is you want to focus on here, what precise world building points you want to be putting into your map. But otherwise, I'm just kind of going to be doing them ad hoc to show off these kind of concepts as we go through. I'm going to call this Norton Rock. There's only one Norton Rock, so it doesn't need an island. All right, Hedge has asked, how do you decide the density of names to include on a map or in a particular area? Great question. Okay, that's a really good point. It depends. It depends on who is going to be using the map. Because the question you always got to ask yourself is this map readable, right? In terms of a player, it has to be readable by someone who doesn't initially know anything about your world, which means that you will want, you know, at least a pinky's distance between each name so that they are all clear and legible. Anything more than that, and if you aren't using different colors, it should be even less than that, because the eye has to be able to differentiate between different areas. The 10-second rule is a good one to use as the basis for creating a map, because if a person who has never seen your map before can't find a specific point within about 10 seconds, then you're going to be dealing with something that's a little bit too top-heavy, too conceptual for them to actually practically use. And if you turn them off, it's about making a first impression. If you turn them off too early, they're not going to be referring to it, they're not going to be relying on it, they're just going to quietly file it under too much to deal with right now, and they'll never really use it. Whereas if you give them a map that's simpler, and then yourself have a map that you already know where the information should be, and you can narrow it down much more quickly if you are already familiar, then you can squeeze a lot more information on there. So always think about how accessible it is to someone who has the prerequisite context for what the map is. So this is just a player map, so I'm not going to absolutely cram it in, and I'm going to make it a priority to do some illustrations later on so that it kind of makes sense within the world. So this is just the labeling. Later I'm going to be doing another live stream for this festival in which I'll be illustrating this particular map, and I've got 3 different kinds of illustration that I'll talk about. I've got some watercolors, I've got some acrylic paints, and we'll really sort of be able to move that around. Okay. How are we looking? We're about halfway. Place upon holder. I love it. All right. So that's kind of given us a fair number of names to work with. All right. We've got that sort of delineation of descriptive names, commemorative names, mythological names. I'm going to just pull the talking head up for a little while I talk about things. And the last one, which is that sort of degenerated name. And between all of them, we can really create a map that feels like it's lived in, like it's alive. And And I have kind of already mentioned that I'm not really working with other languages for this particular map because it's not the focus of this particular video. There are other streams in this festival that talk about making your own languages. And for this particular case, I just wanted to focus on the actual function naming itself. So what we're going to do is I'm going to come out and I'm going to actually talk about adding some practical details and labeling practical details on your map so that you can make it feel like it's lived in and real. So now that we've got all of the points, we're going to start connecting them with some lines. We're talking about routes, talking about rivers, and we're talking about the trading routes over water, the roads as well. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out this brown pen again, and we're going to dive in with a look at the map itself. All right. So we've got several different islands here. We've got could be a caldera, it could be a meteor crater, whatever we want to make it out there. I haven't, you'll notice, named the area. I've got a little compass area down here as well. And then what I will do is I'm going to save all this blank space out here for illustrations of flags and crests later on, for illustrations that are contextual, like ships and sea monsters, and of course for the work on the borders and the aesthetic illustrations as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by creating a network of roads. Now, once upon a time, I made a map that really kind of focused on creating more detail for the viewer on how politics and culture interacted on the map itself, right? And what I mean is that we had some illustrations, yes, but it talked a lot about, like, it had details on what languages everyone spoke, on what places were significant, internationally versus nationally versus locally. And it was a very interesting and very complicated deep dive into world building. And this kind of gives us the opportunity to break that down as well, because we want to always think about making a world feel real and lived in means about giving as much detail as possible, right? And in order to do that, we want to ask ourselves, what are the points of difference? It's always the question we have, right? Everyone here speaks the same language, despite, being, I would say, about 300 miles from point to point on the main two islands, which is, a fair whack of distance. They should at least speak different dialects if this is, a Renaissance or medieval town. But what we can do is, now that we've given this sort of first layer, this is the first layer of information, this is what the locals currently know, this is what the locals currently use. Once I've gone through and I've finished these roads, I want to add in a couple of other layers. One of which will be a sort of an overlay, in terms of it will be accessible by all of the inhabitants of the islands. Anyone will understand what you're talking about, across the whole land. These names are the next level down. They're the middle layers. So, someone up here in Silverton might not know where Light Break it particularly is, although, the upper echelons will. If you've been educated, they will know this smaller area. So this is sort of the middle area. And then I want to go with the local areas. We'll start adding in individual names of things like, inns and glens and shrines and things like that. So by kind of breaking that up into 3 distinct layers, we can make the world feel real. And you don't need to tell the reader that there are 3 layers. You don't want to ruin that illusion. Being a world builder, I think, is much like being a magician. You don't want to tell everyone your secrets. You just want to use it as a tool to help you kind of concentrate your efforts in a particular area. All right. So I'm going to go through, and I know that this is going to make the camera jiggle a bit, so I appreciate your patience with it. I'm going to put all of the roads in. And once the roads are done, I will talk about that next big layer. Because that's when we're going to abandon this sort of casual naming system. And we're going to apply a generic naming system that is very exact. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this world a fantasy post-apocalyptic world. All right. So once upon a time in the long distant past, there was a massive catastrophe that affected an advanced society. And that means that there are ruins, there are bones of old infrastructure that still exist in the world today, that are recognizable as being from a society that once dominated this entire area, but they aren't still being used, that no one benefits from them. They're just sort of there. And that gives us the ability to create a reason that everything has this overarching culture, because they're all descended from the same language. That's why they all share the same language. They might be dialectic, but that sort of continuous influence from that long dead civilization allows them to, you know what, I'm going to put this highway up here, to have that, to explain that connection, despite what is effectively quite a great distance between them if you're only traveling on foot or by horse. And seeing as you're on an island, neither is really an option. And it doesn't have to be, you know, an advanced society if you're doing it this way. It could just be, for instance, after the fall of the Roman Empire in Britain, there were traces, there were relics and ruins of a once great civilization that had since fallen. But in my particular case, what I am going to do is I am going to make these locations advanced, like, you know, modern day advanced kind of things. And I'm going to apply a different naming convention in order to kind of make that work. So we've got this sort of Anglo-Saxon feel here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, yeah, let's do Germanic. All right, cool. We've already got a trace of Germanic up here in Morgansburg. There's a couple of others that sort of share that. And we will use a very different naming structure. So I'm going to use a slightly different icon here. Broken Realm is a great place to begin because that implies some disaster long ago in the past. So I'm going to create this sort of square icon here, nice and thick, and we're going to call it Volks. Volkstum. All right. I don't actually speak German. I just want to acknowledge that. I did just say that they actually shared language, and then I immediately changed that language. But you know what? Consistency is the defense of small minds. Isn't that what they say? Burgis. Just testing out these names. I always test out names out loud. I would recommend it. Just make sure you know how they sound, because if you accidentally name, you know, a town Ashhole, and you don't really think through the consequences of that choice, then you're going to be in for a big problem later on. Second. All right. And the idea that I'm putting down with these is that they feel sort of permanent, but different. Spelled Uber wrong. That's fine. Sure, why not? I'm just kind of making this up as I go along. That's fine. All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to imply the existence of a vast method of transport and communication. And we're going to call this Devil's Folly. Again, we're adding in some context here. Bridge of Fools. Again, we're going to keep that that context of it being, they regard this ancient empire as being filled with fools or hubris. Let's call that Teller's hubris. Why not? Cool. And so by adding in those things, and you can have other icons as well. I'm just adding in sort of this ancient communication system or transport system and the icons themselves. All right. Comment time. Face Strider. Yeah. Quick question. Do you happen to know the size of this particular paper? It is A3, Dylan. I will have to update the description. It is A3. I am aware that you don't use that very often in the States. So it is, you don't use centimeters either. I would say that that's about 24 by 36 centimeters. Somewhere around there. Okay, what was I going to say? Bleak Hawk. Yeah, I like that. All right, and by having that sort of continuous, it's similar to how the towers all share that name. And again, I actually, you know what, we're going to bring that back. These towers actually refer to, instead of being, a medieval wizard's tower with a long, pointed cone at the top, these are spires, skeletons of glass and steel, inhabited by nothing but birds and climbing ivy. And so they look like no other tower that can be found elsewhere, but they echo that kind of idea. Cool, we're doing some world building. I love it. Delightful. Tollberg. Cool. And now we've got a reason to name it Tollingsvale. You know what? I'm going to put an old bridge down here. Only the strands remain, the pillars, the columns. I'm going to call it Devil's Crossing. All right. How are we going for time? 1:18, cool. And again, that's this sort of outer layer. It gives us this sort of overview of large-scale history that's shared by everyone. This sort of medium-scale history of lots of fighting and politics, and everyone's got their own kind of version. And then we're going to go into, in a second, we're going to go into the local stuff. And that's just what the locals kind of know. All right. You know what? I'm actually going to put a city out here in the middle of nowhere. I'm going to call it... You know what? Let's call it Devil's Anchor. We'll abandon the German naming for that consistency of concept. Devil's Anchor, cool. And you know what? I will mirror some of those. Yeah, cool. All right. How's everyone going? Still enjoying it? Any questions? Let me know what you think. I'm happy to help out, give any answers that I possibly can. Because now we're going to come in with some smaller pens. All right. What would you recommend if your setting doesn't have a lot of settlements to fill it out? That's a great question, Jira Vezrin. That's a great question. Here's a general rule of thumb that I tend to apply to my settings, which is that a horse-drawn cart can travel somewhere between 15 to 20 miles a day on typical medieval roads. All right? So it's not all that far. And it gets even slower if you've got a particularly heavy load, but that's sort of the average that you should be working on. So those caravans, those traders, those merchants, those loggers, those brewers, anyone who's moving goods from one place to another is going to have to stop every 15 to 20 miles on a main road. And if they're going to stop there, then they need somewhere safe to stay the night. Right? And that either means that you've got these preset sort of campsites, or you need to have the locals acknowledge that there is a business opportunity there. Because if anyone opens up a stable or an inn there, they're going to make a lot of business. And if you open up an inn, then it's only natural that people will come to work there, that other settlements will start to crop up around it. So every 15 to 20 miles, you should have some kind of inn or settlement, right? Which is a lot, I acknowledge that. But if you've got a map that doesn't have a great deal of these labels on it, if everything's fairly wide spaced, then either you have a reason for that, world building wise, as in there's not a great deal of population, or that's fine. It just means that instead of having settlements every 15 to 20 miles, you're going to have these sort of local icons that we're going to be starting to put in, like clearings or inns or safe quarries or caves or things like that. Somewhere for them to stay that's fairly safe. Because you will explore the world as a merchant in increments of 15 to 20 miles. The rest of the world doesn't matter so much. A rider on a horse can get probably twice that, 40 miles, to 40 to 50 miles, I reckon, on horseback. So moving over a great distance is fine, but that's only if these settlements are, separate from one another. If you're moving large quantities of men, you're going to go as slow as the slowest person. Okay, bit of a tangent. Let's move over here. And again, we're moving into green now, so we're going to start labeling the local places. We've already named these sort of areas like Graycombe, Oakwood, God's Child Glen, and those could refer to, woods, forests, plains, that kind of thing. More likely they refer to provinces or localities. So in this case, we're going to go through and we're going to name things that are significant to the locals but are not significant to everyone else. All right, and that means things like Glen of Small Gods. Talbot's Wood. You know what? I'm just going to make it perfectly clear which word we're dancing around over here. I'm going to call it the Fear. Widow's Wood. Okay, and as you go through, these are the words that the locals refer to as you kind of go through. I don't know what I was looking at then. As you go through, these are the words that the locals are going to be referring to. All right, they're not super important. This is a reference map. When you're thinking in terms of these layers of information, you can completely leave out any one of these layers or any two of these layers and focus just on the third, so that's the information that you give to your players. Rush. So, because remember what I was saying about it being accessible to your players, and the only reason that I'm really layering it up and really thickening the world building here is because we've got a fair amount of time and we can do that. Rose Child's Glen. A lot of glens, a lot of areas. People are traditionally, historically, connected to woods and glens and vales. They love them. Old forest. How are we looking? Personally recommend that those unsafe zones could include the names of settlements, turned ruins and remnants of what was once. Yes. Yeah. So, yes. So going back to Azira's comment about the distance between different settlements. If it is a horror setting, if you do have a lot of danger between them, it gets even more important to have safe houses along the way, or to completely, like, there's nothing between them and no one travels at all. And if that is the case, then you can just completely leave the map bare, but I think you have the opportunity as a DM to set up on the map the opportunity for you to put in where encounters will happen, where bandits will be, where vampires roam or werewolves have their dens. So again, that makes that dichotomy between the DM and the player maps so much more significant. All right, moving out. I like glam as well. Glam as well. Glam as well. We're going to call this Fool's Watch. All right. Now I've added in a few more here. I'm actually going to briefly stop, if you'll forgive me, for a cup of tea. And this is the opportunity to again, ask any questions, clarify anything, talking about methods here, because what I'm going to then go through and do is I'm going to go through and illustrate. I'm going to shade in the sides of these mountains and then do some of the coastlines so that when we come through and we illustrate the map later on, which we'll do in the second of the live streams today, then we can really focus on that without having to come back and redo any of this stuff. Now, I've used different colors for this map. And again, this is a particular style of map that you don't necessarily need to use. If you have, for instance, a horror setting, If you have, for instance, a horror setting, like Azira was saying, then you can do a completely different genre of map. You can keep it monochrome or even just black and red in order to really kind of sink that vibe in. You can focus on making the font look really good. I actually have a series coming out. It starts not next week, but the week after, on different genres of maps, starting with post-apocalyptic, going into horror and pirate. And I am going to plug it because this style of map is just a very quick and easy one for me, and it still looks okay for giving to the players and for planning things out. But it's not very heavy on the aesthetic of the setting, if you know what I mean. This is just for use, for ease of use. Green tea, love it. What are we looking at? It is tea time. If you're making a map as we go along, then I absolutely recommend having a cup of tea now. Is everyone making a map? Where is everyone hailing from? Is it very, very late over in the United States? It is currently 11:28 down here in Australia. I'm speaking to you from a very sunny Saturday morning. All right. All right, now my throat's a bit better, so I'm going to put this tea to one side. Oh, Dylan, Dylan's asking about recommendations for tea. And Dylan, you fool, I am descended from the British, and I have a great many opinions about tea, all of which I'm certain that anyone from any Asian or African continental countries, they will disagree with any of my opinions. But I have very British opinions about tea. That being said, I'm drinking green tea because it's very refreshing. And otherwise, I tend to drink Earl Grey or French Earl Grey. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through and illustrate this side. As you can see, I'm continuing these brush strokes. Any number of ways that you can do this. A good fun way is to get a very lightly wetted paintbrush, a very thin one, and you wet the tip slightly, and you just come through and very gently sort of spread the ink. That, however, it's a little fiddly. If you get the amount of water on your paintbrush wrong, then it's going to be, it's going to spill everywhere, and you're going to get bad marks. So you could do in pencil. Pencil doesn't turn up very well on the scan, I will say. Or you could do it with a pen like I am doing and a hatchet. And in which case you can either do it with a thin pen, which looks pretty good, or you can do it with a thick pen like I am doing here, which is a much sort of harsher look for the sides. But I'm not against it. I'm always experimenting with different looks. I haven't actually done this thick hatching for a while. So I wanted to see how it would turn out. And I think overall it looks all right. This is that UniPosca pen again, the same one I used for the making of the ridgelines themselves. I'm going to turn this back on. And I really appreciate everyone's enjoyment of this. I hope you are enjoying it, and everyone's patience with me. I do enjoy making live streams, but I must acknowledge that my usual medium is to record several hours worth of making a map and then just sort of cut out everything that isn't strictly relevant, which means that I can control what it looks like, what it sounds like. I can take out a lot of my umming and ahhing, and I can drink my tea in peace. That was pretty peaceful, but I'm haunted. Haunted by the idea that I should get back to work. All right, now we've done those, let's come through. What I'm going to do is I've got a series of pens. Look, I've got so many pens in this place, but generally speaking, in order to make it really easy for everyone, I use Artliner and UniPin because they're easily accessible for me. So before, I used the Artliner 0.2 blue to do these islands. I'm going to come through with 0.4, which is a thicker one, so that I can do, I was going to do the coastlines, and that's wrong. That's bad, Ryan. We don't want to do the coastlines because I'm going to be illustrating later. I'm going to do the rivers instead. Ask ourselves where the rivers are going to be. And again, these are the kinds of things that come up when you sketch the map early on. If you didn't sketch, like I have not sketched, then you're just going to have to try to figure it out as you go along. And again, you look for clues in terms of where the mountain ranges are, where the settlements are. All settlements need a source of water, and where these bays are. So always ask yourself, what's formed the bay? What has created the inlet? And in this particular case, it's very easy to say, such a long, thin, defined bay is definitely the mouth of a river. And then we can connect Augustin and Kingsman to the same river as well. Rivers are a great source of movement. You can move much faster on a river than you can on a road if you have a great deal of cargo. I'm just going to point that out. Well, in one direction, not in the other direction. So that's a good thing to know. But it does mean that larger cities, just by that old force of economics, will generally be further downriver because it's easier to support a larger population downriver than it is upriver because you need to move all those goods. All right. Also ask yourself where is going to be defined by rivers in terms of your mountain ranges and your altitudes. And I'm not saying that rivers carve out mountains, which is kind of correct, but not always. There's a lot more forces at work. But in terms of if you have peaks, then the rivers are going to try to get downhill as quickly as possible. So the rivers are going to form from the mountains as much as the mountains are formed by erosion. Don't you love talking about geography on a Friday night / Saturday morning? This is what we're all here for. I'm going to check the comments again in 3, 2, 1. Product description. It's 2:31 in Scotland. Good gracious, half pint. It's 2:30 in the morning. I mean, I don't want to tell you to go to bed because I'm not your mother, but but I certainly wasn't awake at 2:30 in the morning. Welcome to Saturday. All right, we're not going to add in too many rivers because, again, we don't want to overburden the map with information that's not going to be useful. Generally speaking, a DM's map or an author's map of a fantasy world doesn't need rivers for the plot. Like, you'll need the major rivers, but you won't need to fill it with rivers. That just makes it feel like a map and not like, you know, just a page with words on it. Rivers really add to the authentic feeling that a map has. So you can use them to really fill in the blanks, to make things feel more authentic, more lived in, but you don't want to overdo it because it is taking up valuable space on the page. All right. All right, how are we looking? I think we're looking pretty good. How are we going for time? 1:36. All right, we only got about 20 minutes left, which is enough time for me to come through and do some icons. All right. How are we looking? Can we see that? Actually, I say icons. What am I talking about? Not icons. I'm going to do titles. All right, we're going to get out my big pen again. See this one? This is the Uni Posca. And now that we've filled in everything, and I have an idea of what the naming structures are like, what the current people are like when they lived there, I have an idea of what I can name the broader areas. So we've got big islands, we've got a chain of islands out here, and we've got outer reaches over there. And that gives us some context of what I'm going to name everything. So I'm going to, generally speaking, a lot of things are named after the concepts of lands or kings or bounties. So what I'm going to call it is hang on, I'm thinking. All right, I've got an idea. I'm going to start with a subtitle. And that means that I can break out from there. Legacy. All right. Subtitles. What do you mean subtitles? You'll notice that I'm doing the stems of the words in the thick pen, and I'll come through with a thinner pen in a minute, and I will add some sort of decoration and aesthetic to that. You know what? No one ever accused me of being imaginative. I mean, I should hope that they do. I run a map making channel. You can hear how hard I'm concentrating on this, can't you? What's he thinking? He's thinking about so many things. Oh my gosh. All right, Kingsland and Lesser. Now, doing titles like this, you may notice I haven't worried particularly much in this live stream about doing like fonts really well, because I've got other things to occupy my time. But doing fonts properly, as you can see that I'm doing now, it does take a great deal more time and concentration. All right, lesser I. Yeah, cool. I call this one Fool's Reach. And again, now that we've got those subtitles, you've got two contexts for who's referring to that area. So if you're referring to, you know, the current kingdom, or, you know, whatever politics we got here, then you're going to call them Kingsland and Lesser I. But if you're referring to the context of that ancient empire, that ancient civilization, then you've got different names. Devil's Legacy, Fool's Reach. I'm going to call this the Outer Grasp. Again, we're giving, like, it's reach, but it gives that sort of feeling, that context of control. Grasp. Here we go. Concentrating. Do. All right. And then we'll call this just the well. All right. Okay, now that we've got the bare bones of it, I'm going to come in with a thinner pen, which is the 0.4, and I'm going to do some decoration on the individual names. So I'm going to zoom in. Zoom. Zoom. Boop, boop. All right, check the comments. I like sundials, that's a good one. All right, I'm going to go for a sort of gothic theme here, which I practiced quite recently for that genre series that I mentioned. And that will allow us to give this map a little bit of aesthetics. This is a bit of an aesthetic teaser, but I think that naming points is as important as you know, giving them aesthetics. So the actual words are as important as how you present those words. So I would recommend that this is a part of how you create your naming structures, is how you present that naming structure to your players, to your reader. You know, if you've got a very homely kingdom, then you can get away with something that looks a bit like handwriting. If you've got a horror kingdom, then something gothic is going to work. But if you have something that's pirate-esque or steampunk, then you're going to have different prerequisites for how you present those names to the reader. Don't forget that a map is first and foremost not a document, but a picture. And we should be treating it like a picture and not just like a document. It's how we compress so much meaning into a map, is by thinking through the presentation of that information, that meaning. All right. All right. How are we looking? Now, I hope everyone's keen to see me illustrate this. I do have plans for what I'm going to be illustrating. I'm going to use a couple of different mediums in order to achieve that. And I'm going to try to make those mediums as accessible as possible. So I'm going to really break it down and talk about how you can decorate your maps. And I'm going to do this particular map so that we can see it in action. So that starts at, it'll start at 5 p.m. my time, so in about 5 hours or so. So it'll be first thing in the morning for my Scottish friends. But otherwise, you can tune in later. This is going to be available on my channel. It's going to be available on the playlist. And I look forward to seeing as many people there as possible. Once again, I do want to thank Madeline James for putting this all together. I'm fairly certain Madeline's probably gone to bed by now, which is very fair. She's had a very big day. But absolutely everyone, if you haven't already checked out her channel or the rest of the playlist, you absolutely should. Cannot recommend enough. There's a couple that I will in particular be checking out. I have always wanted to learn how to do music for my fantasy settings. And so you will not be able to stop me from checking out Artifaction's addition to the playlist, which is on creating music for your settings. As if I needed another hobby. All right. So you see how we've decorated that, make it look good. It does stand out a little bit against the how we've presented the rest of the quotes. But what I might go through after this stream has finished is I'll just go through and decorate everything separately so that we can just go straight into the illustration. What do you reckon? I think that works out. Devil's Legacy. All right, let me check the chat quickly. How are we going over there, Sunder Isles? It's a bit quiet. How are we looking? Oh. There we go. This is a great opportunity as well for those who aren't new to the channel or have wanted to see a particular topic, haven't seen it before. This is a great chance to ask me directly, because if I haven't already made a video on it, then I am currently planning out a couple of events coming up in the future that I can try to squeeze them in on, or I can just point you to a video that I've already done. I know that's... There we go, that looks quite nice, doesn't it? All right, moving on over here. There we go. I know that there's a lot to cover in terms of map making, and you would think that after 18 months of creating videos for this channel, I would have run out of things to talk about, but shock and awe, I have not. I think I will have a lot to talk about indefinitely into the future as we talk about different styles and different materials and different focuses of information. There's always something new to talk about. All right, here we go. I'm just going to finish off these labels, and then we will kind of talk about things. I realize that I'm concentrating so hard on doing these labels decoratively that I'm not really saying anything of particular use to anyone at the moment. Focus, Ryan, what are we talking about? Hang on. See, I just did it again. As soon as I have to focus on doing a serif, everything else goes out the window, which is good, of course. You know, you've got to concentrate on your maps in order for them to be good It's not something you can put on in the background. You do have to give it all of your attention. But it does mean, I think, that that you guys have to be patient. And we hate being patient. It's the year of our Lord 2025. Patience? I think not. That is not why we invented TikTok. All right, there we go, Fool's Reach. How to name currency for your fantasy world. You know, I actually, on that topic that Dylan's just brought up about naming currencies for your fantasy world, and I will point out that I only really do maps. That's all I do. I realized when I started this channel that there are a bajillion world building channels out there. And a lot of them just sort of wander between topics of creating the fantasy world. You know, how to, create political timelines or plot out family trees or, do all that kind of stuff. And I was like, you know what? I actually don't want to step on any toes. I don't want to talk about things that aren't really in my wheelhouse. I really just want to... I need to find the C. All right, there. I really just want to talk about maps. I know how to make maps. I can make maps. My maps look moderately okay. Not to toot my own horn. And that's just what I will focus on, is creating maps. But that does mean that, for instance, I think it was my 4th video on this channel. I made a video on how to create a trade map, like a map that would be relevant to and usable for a trader in a fantasy world. And it had not only, where toll bridges were and, where the toll houses and trade routes could be found, but how much it would cost to freight something by sea from one place to another, or to hitch a ride on a caravan, how much cargo would cost, per £100 versus how much it would cost to move a person. And as well, other details like what the conversion rates between different currencies were going to be, what the sort of range of goods you could find in a given town was, what climate was around those towns, which would affect the kind of produce that you could buy there, and so on and so forth. And it got really, really, really complicated. And I actually ended up taking the video down not too long ago because the quality just wasn't great. I knew much more about making maps than I did about making videos. And I really kind of want to bring those back. If everyone's interested in those kinds of things, if you want to talk more about making currencies and that kind of thing, it's certainly something that I could broach upon. There we go. In order to make a video. All right, so we have titled everything. We've got a fair kind of whack of what that kind of looks like. And you can, of course, go through, I did mention, you can absolutely go through and come back in with, I know I just zoomed out, with these little labels and tidy them up. I would absolutely recommend, always recommend, whenever you create a map, if you feel like your maps look amateurish, what you need to do first, before you do anything else, is get a couple of different thicknesses of pen. If you can get a couple of thicknesses of pen and use the thinner one to do, smaller labels and the serifs on the larger labels, then you're really going to just immediately level up how good your map looks, how professional it looks. That's absolutely my first recommendation for anyone who's creating a map like this. All right. So let's get back on topic and talk about finishing up this naming concept. All right. So we've gone through and we talked about what we're naming in terms of the priority list, which is settlements first. Actually, I'll bring up the slides. All right. Talk about naming points, which is great. And we're going to go through, then we went through and we talked about the major points that you want to name. Settlements first, then it's regions and realms. And again, the reason that we're doing this is because that's where the plot is going to be found. Right? Then we go through to landmarks, and the landmarks are going to be, in this particular case, it's not like natural landmarks. We're talking, ruins, towers, toll houses, or trading posts, or the kind of places that you stop that aren't settlements, but are still relevant to the world building, the culture, the history, the mythology, that kind of thing. Then you go through and you do the geography, which is rivers, bays, straits, and forests, and things like that. Individual peaks are there as well, because again, those are used for navigating, but often they won't really come up in a fancy novel. Your readers, your players, they don't need to know that kind of stuff, so it's not as important. And then last on the list is the roads themselves. I'm not saying don't put roads on your map, I'm saying don't label them unless you really have space, so you're not cluttering your map up, or unless it's very, very important, culturally speaking, to label this road. So for instance, I would not label, the high street in a given town, but I would label the Silk Road. That's kind of what we're looking for here. Right? Then we move on and we talk about how you're naming things. The actual structure of names, what kind of methods you're using, and we started with a descriptive name, something like, Fernshire, or the Oakwood, or Oars Rest. These are all descriptive names that talk about what you can find there and what function they fulfill. Then you can move on to commemorative naming, which is named after a person or an event, a saint, or someone who has a significant function. Could be king, could be founder, whatever you want. Next is the mythic naming. And that's the difference between history and myth, is that myth is up to interpretation and myth can change, whereas the point of history is that it's recorded. If it's not recorded, I would put it under the category of myth or legend. Okay? If it changes very regularly, it certainly is a myth and not history. History is supposed to be fairly objective. Then we go down into nicknaming, and the nicknaming we'll talk about in a bit, but that is the taking of a name and sort of really making it as informal, as casual, as degenerative as possible, so that it's easy to say. And how we do that is we talk about degenerative names in terms of removing sounds that aren't particularly significant or easy to say. We talk about making them translinear, so that the example that I gave there was of the Baranduin in Lord of the Rings is the elven name for the river, but the hobbits translated that as Brandywine. So it had a new meaning in their language, which was completely separate from the original meaning. Then you come out and you can use euphony and rhythm, and that's just making it rhyme and making it have a nice sort of cadence to it. So something like Billingsbrook or Sandershire, those are both euphonic names. They share that alliteration, but Inning upon Heights, Stoke upon Water, things that have that nice sort of rhythm to it are also in that category. And then the last one is the borrowed patterns, which is one of the first things we actually did when we borrowed the word shire in several of these regional names. And that's, you can absolutely do it if they have the right meaning, and that becomes a descriptive name. But if the locals are naming something and they don't fully understand the meaning of the words that they're using, then you can really have fun with this. You can name things shire that aren't actually a shire. You can name things like, what did we give? Flame Cove Bay, because the locals don't actually know what cove means, but they do know what the word bay means. So they already knew that it was called Flame Cove. They've just added on a redundant word there. All right. Then we go through and we talk about why we're naming the points. So we did talk about that. I know you haven't seen the slide because I forgot to put it on, but we did talk about why we're naming points, who's going to be using them, what the purpose of the map is. Is it a DM's map? Is it a player's map? Are your players going to be looking for adventure? Are they going to be looking for trade? Are you putting in politics? Are you going to be using those 3 layers that we talked about? So this map has the 3 layers of what is known to the locals, what is known to the nation, and what is known internationally. And again, that's not something that we need to advertise to our players, but that does help us to break down the meaning of the map into something that's a little bit more comprehensible and understandable. All right. So I want to take this opportunity to thank all of my Patreon subscribers. I appreciate all of the support that I get for this channel. It is wonderful to be able to do projects like this and contribute to this world building festival that Madeline has organized. And I hope that it has been an educational experience for you. Stick it in the chat if you have enjoyed it. Tune in for the next part, which I will be starting in 5 hours hence. But until then, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you in a few hours or next week to continue the series of maps that we've been going on with and talk about the differences between a DM's map and a player's map. But until then, happy mapping